Today I'm going to talk about quite a famous poem. It's the 兵车行, in English translation, The Army Wagons, a ballad. And this poem is quite remarkable in a few different ways. If we just look at the form of it, you can see just from the text here that the form is quite irregular. This is a ballad form, so Du Fu, of course, has quite a lot of poems in the ballad form, but among the poems in the ballad form, this one stands out still for being, the irregular line length, mostly 7-liners, but there's also like 3-liners, and there's 10-liners and 5-liners. I'm like 5-word lines. That's what I meant when I said 5-liners and 7-liners, of course. And we have all these interjections like 君不见, 君不见. This is all mainstays of the ballad form. But in this poem, Du Fu is also being extremely colloquial. So the language here is almost like reading modern Mandarin, you would say. And it's quite incredible that Du Fu, and a poet who can be so abstruse and difficult when he wants to, he can also be so easy to understand when he tries to show us that side. So that's what we see in this poem, and even though the poem is quite long, there's 30-something lines, 40-something lines, this will probably be quite fast to get through, because there's not that many difficulties of vocabulary and so forth in it. And the theme, of course, is the army wagons. This is kind of sort of a protest song, which is also perhaps a reason why it's been very frequently anthologized. And actually, I think this one poem is actually largely responsible for the image that Du Fu has had, particularly, I think, after the establishment of the People's Republic, of sort of a patriotic poet with almost sort of a sort of Wayne Guthrie sort of person, walking around the countryside and feeling out all the problems of the poor people, and voicing his complaints to the throne in folksy and simple language, And so this poem really fits that image, even if not much else by Du Fu does. But anyway, this is actually this is a protest poem. There's no doubt about that. Even though, of course, like everything that is a protest in ancient China has to be very indirect. So we don't really get any references to any specific political goings-on. But the general context of this poem, when we know the general context, it becomes quite clear that what the intent of the poem is. So this is likely written in 751, around that time. So it's before the breakout of the An-Lushan rebellion, but Tang China was, at this point, it was involved in many wars, and these wars were increasingly taxing, and they didn't really provide any lasting advantages for the empire. And so even if the poem itself doesn't mention these by name, this is the general background of the poem. And I can just give you some examples of the conflicts that they were involved in. There was a long-standing conflict with Tibet in the west, which was basically the one closest power that they had regular sort of clashes and back and forth with. And just around this time as well, around 750 or so, there had been a huge campaign in the south, in what is now Yunnan. So in the Yunnan area in the Tang Dynasty, there was an independent kingdom called Nanzhao. And Nanzhao had actually been more or less sort of a friendly state, or a subsidiary state, a tributary state to Tang China. But then it turned, relations sort of soured during Xuanzong's reign, and he sent armies to subdue Nanzhao. And this was a catastrophic failure. So at one point, for example, 200,000 men were sent there, and 9/10 of them just died from malaria. So all of these wars, they weakened the country, which is really a very clear sign that an empire is sort of on its downward hill rather than the upward hill. When wars weaken the country but are still necessary to maintain the borders, and it's not that the borders are expanded in order to protect the country. So that was basically the situation at the time. And perhaps that is enough background information in this case. So let's just look at the text. 车辚辚，马萧萧，行人弓箭各在腰. And here you get the feeling for, this kind of talksy, folksy, colloquial rhythms, which show up just from the beginning. We got the 车辚辚，马萧萧. This 辚辚 and 萧萧, both of these are onomatopoeic, at least originally. So this 辚辚 is the sound of many chariots, perhaps like ning, 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 ning. That would be the sound of many chariots passing by in the street. And xiao xiao, well, it's the sound of a horse. Both of these are ancient, actually. They occur in the Shi Jing. And this kind of folk poetry, or imitating folk poetry, that is actually a tradition that goes back to the Shi Jing. So we can definitely see this as a sort of a chain in the evolution of folk poetry, or rather sort of elite versions of folk poetry, which goes from the Shi Jing and then through the whole Yue Fu tradition, which Du Fu really draws on in these poems, and to Du Fu's time, and this is his contribution to that tradition. 行人弓箭各在腰, you have men walking, so the men walking are the people, in this case, who are joining the army, or have joined the army. Involuntarily, it will be seen later. Each with bow and arrows at the waist. Yes, as you see, the language is so simple. There's nothing I need to explain here. 爷娘妻子走相送，尘埃不见咸阳桥. So 爷娘, moms and dads, this is of course supposed to be, this ye here stands in for the ye with a fu, father, radical on top. So it's the same character that is in modern ye, your grandfather. Ye Nyang, here it refers to moms and dads. 爷娘妻子走相送. Actually, in the original manuscripts and the texts we have by Du Fu, of course we don't have manuscripts, but we have old editions. There's an original note to this line, which specifies a line from the Ballad of Mulan that this line is based on. So this is Yue Fu poetry, really, and the line that he quotes goes like this: 不闻爷娘哭子声，但闻黄河流水已渐渐. So she doesn't listen to, or she doesn't hear her parents crying for their child. She only hears the waters of the Yellow River flowing by a drop at a time, something like that. Yeah. 尘埃不见咸阳桥. So Xianyang Qiao, that is a bridge outside the western gate of Chang'an. So we have to imagine that we are somewhere in the outskirts of Chang'an. That is the imperial capital. And this Xianyang Qiao is a bridge in the direction of the western battlefields. So the marching soldiers are probably on their way, perhaps to go and fight the Tibetans then. And the marching soldiers, they stir up so much dust so that you can't see the bridge. Yeah. We'll go on. 牵衣顿足拦道哭，哭声直上干云霄. And this is, of course, also typical for the ballad form, that there's all kinds of repeat words. This would be really out of place in a Lü Shi, to have one line ending with ku and the other next line beginning with the same character, ku. But it works really well if you want to imitate sort of the way that people speak, which is sort of part of the charm of this kind of poetry, this format. Yeah, you can just compare with the translation here. There will be nothing, I think, extraordinarily difficult. 枯生之上，干云霄, rise straight up against. Yeah, gan means to strike towards something. And of course, the very directness and the simplicity of the language, of course, gives it great force of expression. And I think you can feel this after just a few lines. And you really have to sort of try to, you should read them a few at a time, and just to feel this rhythm and how the rhymes are so natural. Actually, even today, after so much phonetic change has happened, which I think is quite remarkable. 道旁过者问行人，行人但云简行频。典型频 I'm sorry, I fucked that up. 行人但云典型频。过者 here we see that the rest of the poem actually takes the form of a dialogue, although there is only one person speaking in it. 过者 would be Dufu then, who is standing by the side of the road, and he asks one of the people walking, someone passing by the road, asks that. And then this 行人, the man on the march, and again repeat, 问行人,行人但云, he just says, and all the rest of the poem is the response of the man who has been drafted into the army. And 典型, 行人但云典型频. 典型 is forced conscription, so you can imagine that someone just comes to your village and says, this guy, like 点名, and you have to 行, come with us, go with us, the 典型, 频, frequent. So, and then he goes on, the 行人, the man on the march. 或从15北防河，便知40西营田。防河, guarding the river. Yeah, so these are various things that you can do, or you can be told to do when you're in the army. You can be told to go and guard the Yellow River, so that no one invades from the north. And Yingtian, this I suppose perhaps needs some explanation. As soon as they reach 40, they work military settlements in the west. As far as I understand, Yingtian, this refers to a policy that existed in Tang China of establishing settlements in border areas where men were given plots to farm, and in exchange for these plots, they were expected to be available at order for various military needs. So the primary enemy in the west was Tibet, so these were established on the western frontier then as a sort of bulwark or a sort of standing reserve of men that you could always draw on if need be. So basically the idea here is, of course, from 15, a very young age, of course, for a soldier, to 40 when you're perhaps in Tang China already, you could already be expected to be dead. This would be your whole life, just serving in the military, if you were unlucky. And then it goes on. 去时里正雨裹头，归来头白还戍边。Li Zheng is what's called the village headman here, so that would be a person in the village who's responsible for, among other things, registrating the population, for example. A village headman, there's a Li Zheng. And he gives them a turban. I suppose that this is somehow a marker of manhood. And it just said in the last line, conscription at 15, so perhaps they would do this in a great hurry. They would give him his turban, and now he's a man, and there aren't any able-bodied men left to go and guard the frontier or fight the Tibetans or the Nanzhao, so we'll have to do with 15-year-old lads who just had their grown man's hat put on their heads for the first time. Something like that. I think that's how we have to understand this. And when they come back with white hairs, and then it's off to Shu Bian, garrison the frontier again. Yeah, their whole life is basically consumed in military service. That's what we get from these 4 lines. It goes on. 边庭流血成海水，物黄开边亦未矣. This Wu Huang are warrior emperors. Of course, Wu Huang there is not a Tang emperor called Wu Huang, but there was of course, a very famous emperor of the Han Dynasty called the Han Wu Di. So this is quite common in Tang poetry, that things that could be seen as too directly referring to current affairs were often masked in historical terms so that they would seem less offensive. I don't know who many people actually thought that wasn't easy to see through, but still, this is quite common for the sake of decorum, and perhaps in order to save your own skin, if the emperor would look at your poem, which of course would be a lucky occurrence in itself, I suppose, and something that Du Fu worked intensely to make it happen, actually, and we will talk more about that in later talks. Anyway, so Wu Huang, of course, here is a stand-in for Emperor Xuanzong, who wanted to expand his empire, but it didn't go very well, and he didn't get enough. Yi Wei, his plans to extend the frontier are not yet done. Yi Wei hasn't had enough, even though the Bianting, the frontiers, are flowing in the blood of our soldiers, flowing in blood to the extent that they form seas, the pools of blood. And yeah, I mean, there are gruesome examples of battles that were fought in this period. It's almost like World War II, 1 million dead at Stalingrad. Not really that scale, but still, they would go and fight like a fortress, and try to take a fortress from the Tibetans, and tens of thousands would be dead, and they wouldn't have gotten 1 millimeter closer, but the emperor still wanted them to do it, and so on and so forth. So there were lots of examples of this, how men were really expendable back in these days, and that, I suppose, is the main complaint that is voiced in this poem. Then you go, 君不见汉家山东200州，千村万落生荆棘. Usually in a ballad form, when you come to like 君不见, this is really a formula. 君不见, haven't you heard? The poem is supposed to reach some kind of climax. And so this is sort of what the whole proceeding leads up towards. I told you this, I told you that, and I told you the third thing, and now, haven't you seen, by the way, and also how all the 200 provinces of the empire have tens and 10,000s of the villages that are just overgrown with thorns and briars. So here we reach a climax of desolation and despair. And again, honestly, I must say, it wasn't until I read this poem that I realized what this 君不见 really does refer to, because it's obvious that it is this dialogue format. Haven't you heard? Haven't you seen? Of course, it's literally literally, haven't you seen? But here it makes more sense to translate it as haven't you heard, of course. But Du Fu has actually really constructed it so cleverly. So you have he imagines himself talking to a man who's been drafted into the army, and the army man tells him all of these things. And then the army man says, 君不见, and it actually really fits well in. It's not just a formula. It actually makes sense in the context of the poem. And that is really not always the case, because this 君不见, it occurs over and over again in the ballad format without any hint of there being a dialogue involved. But I guess that is sort of the basic idea of this 行, the ballad format. And the 行 also means to walk, right? So we can imagine perhaps the earliest concept or idea of the ballad format are people walking on the road and talking to each other about things of immediate relevance to themselves and making poetry about that. So like a talking blues or something like that. Just the 8th century version of that in China. Now, there's more anachronism here, of course. Hanjia, again talking as if this was the dynasty, the Han dynasty and not the Tang dynasty. This is merely a historical pastiche. Du Fu is sort of implicitly telling his readers this has nothing to do with what's happening now. And he also takes care to put in the R by Zhou, because Zhou was the not the administrative unit in the Tang era. In the Tang era, the provinces were called Jun and not Zhou. So this is historicizing. And 千村万落, Luo here is 10,000 hamlets. Yeah, Luo is a settlement. I like this word. It's sort of a settlement is sort of a place where people have fallen, Luo, into place. So 千村万落, 生荆棘. So 生荆棘, overgrown with thorns and briars. Agriculture has been neglected because the men are off fighting the wars. And he goes on in the next line about that. 纵有贱妇把锄犁, 何生龙母无东西. 贱妇, sturdy wives. There are sturdy wives to hold the hoe and plow because her husband has been conscripted, right? So the wives have to do all the farm work by themselves, and grain grows on the field boundary slopes. 何生龙母. The longmu are the field boundary slopes. This is the correct translation as far as I can see. My understanding here is that these field boundary slopes are sort of, they mark the boundaries between my field and your field, basically. So they are not places in a normal situation where grain actually grows. It's not supposed to grow there, and that makes it that because they grow on the boundary place, you can't really see what's what on the field, what is mine and what is yours, and you lose your sense of direction. That's the idea here, of course. 况夫秦兵耐苦战，被驱不易，全与鸡. Yeah, 况夫. It's bad for all of us, but it's worst for the troops from Qin. Why? Well, supposedly they are the best warriors of the empire, Qin then being the area of the western parts of the empire and the area around the Shanghai region, which had this warlike reputation, of course. They're driven on, no different from dogs and chickens. Yeah, no problem there language-wise. 长者虽有问，亦复敢生恨 question mark then. 且如今年冬，未休关西卒. So the 长者, this is still the conscript talking to Du Fu. So 长者 would be his address to Du Fu, like you, sir. And 义夫, conscript, yeah, that is how he refers to himself. So even though you might ask this question, how would I dare to say anything about what I think about it? So 敢, of course, this is often used. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's very often used in an asking sense. And it then mean 不敢, which may be quite confusing, but this is language for you. 敢 means here 不敢, and turns the whole thing into a question. 且如今年冬, yeah, it's like they drafted previous years and now they do it again. And 未修关西卒, 关西, 关西, of course, is the area to the west of the passes that would be the same as the Qinbing, the Qin region. And also it contrasts a little bit, of course, with the Shandong. So the Shandong, the east of the mountain, and the west of the pass. That would be, we're taking the whole empire here, basically. Everyone has to go to the army. 县官己所租，租税何从出? Another of these ones. The line ending and line starts are the same. 信之生男恶，反是生女好. Look at the translation here. County officials, 县官. Actually, I would have thought reading this that 县官 means county officials, so it's easy to be fooled by this. But my edition gives several quotations from the 史记 and other works, and which show actually that this word 县官 was employed as a euphemism for the central court, or even for the emperor himself. So it's not just county officials demand taxes, it's the emperor wants our money, basically. That's what it says. Urgently demand taxes. 租 is taxes that are paid in grain. That's why we have the grain radical. So 租, that's where that comes from. But where would we get any grain to pay you from when we have to go and fight all the wars? Yes, this is a great conundrum, and one of the many reasons that led up to the great weakening and temporary collapse of the Tang Central Authority, which was about to break out just any day now in the 750s. This 信之生男恶，反是生女好. Yeah, this goes on in the next line. 生女犹得嫁比邻，生男埋没随百草. So, of course, he says that it's better to get a girl when if your wife is pregnant and she gets a girl, you're happier than if you would get a boy. This is, of course, these lines sound much milder in their impact if you don't take into account the traditional values, which are that it's better to get boys than girls. That was the sort of general, the general way that people looked upon it, and actually, honestly, to a large degree, still look upon it in China. If you get a daughter, you can still marry her to your neighbor. Yeah, bi ling, a close neighbor. This ling is if you want to know where this word comes from, a lin was actually a basic sort of organizational unit in the Zhou dynasty China, and it consisted of 5 families. And this continued with some modifications in Tang China as well. So this is really sort of your closest, the people closest around you that are not in your family. Bilin, the close neighbor. We go on, and we're quite near the end now. 君不见 again. 君不见青海头，古来白寿无人收. It's nice, isn't it? I love the translation here by Stephen Owen. Haven't you seen by Kokonor 青海头? 青海 is, as you know, of course, a great salt lake in the western region of China, in what is now called the Qinghai province, and we call it usually in English nowadays Qinghai as well. It's a salt lake, and it is exactly in the area which was hotly contested between the Tang Empire and the Tibetans at the time. But the translation here, Kokonor, yeah, this I think was, he can be quite colonial when he wants to, Stephen Owen, because this is more of a sort of Central Asian explorer appellation for this area. It's a Mongolian name for the place, so I don't really know why we should use that here in a translation of a Tang Dynasty poem where there were no Mongolians in the region. But anyway, it sounds romantic. I have to give him that. 君不见青海头，古来白骨无人收. This 白骨无人收, from ancient times, white bones have never been recovered, are not recovered by anyone. This is actually taken directly from an existing ballad that existed in Du Fu's time. So he's really using material also from the existing poetic tradition of ballad poetry. 新鬼反冤旧鬼哭，天阴与世生啾啾. Yeah. Really moody end to the poem, I must say. And there's nothing I can remark on here, language-wise. I think it's all perfectly clear when you compare with the translation. I hope I said these two right now. Jiu jiu, perhaps it's chiu chiu. Well, jiu jiu, anyway, it's the sound of their weeping. It's another one of these onomatopoeic words. So that's it. That's a quite a long ballad and a very colloquial and pretty easy to understand piece of work, and very special in Du Fu's catalogue for being such a colloquial and sort of you really get the feeling of what Du Fu might have sounded like talking almost when you look at this, which is really not something you can say about most poems or most poets writing in classical Chinese. At least not a barbarian like me. I don't have that capacity. Anyway, thank you for listening, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.